Perfect. Okay. All right. So now we're recording. Just to let you guys know, this is a normal Saturday at my house, so there might be some noise in the background. I might actually have to leave every once in a while and come back. Probably not, but it's a possibility. So please forgive me for any of that stuff. This is just a normal family Saturday, so keep that in mind. Before we get started, normally people get extra credit for these things, or like O'Brien knows from the last exam, there was like a 10% boost to your exam score. Today is going to be a little bit different. So you guys have been studying. I hope you guys anyway have been studying for the final already. And now we're only 3 days away, 2 days away. So because of that, what I want to do is narrow things down for you. I hate teaching to an exam, but since we're only a few days away, I don't mind doing it today. So I guess the benefit for being here today, there's not going to be extra credit, but what I'm going to do, instead of taking your questions, I'll do that at the end, but instead of doing it the way we usually do, I've already written the final. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through it right now with you, all 100 questions, each one of them. So you and whoever watches this video is going to know every single question on the exam. So you don't have to guess anymore. You don't have to look at all the material and figure out what you need to study. I'm giving it to you right now. So does that sound good to everybody?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. And because it's so long, and because I am admittedly teaching to the exam, I am going to go through this quickly. So if you ever need me to stop or slow down and re-explain something, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to truck right through it. And then at the end, that's when I plan to actually take your questions and really explain concepts if you want them explained. But what my goal right now is to knock these questions out for you and anybody watching the video who's just interested in knowing the answers so they can prepare for the exam. And then they can worry about the rest of the video and where you're actually learning concepts. So here we go. Let me share my screen. All right. So can someone confirm you can see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So here's what we're going to do. Like I said, we're going to go through each of these one by one. I'm going to tell you, basically give you the answers and then tell you how I might change the questions. Because remember, the questions that are coming from the last three chapters, chapters 13, 19, and 20, those will be rewritten, right? So what you're going to see on the screen is what the way they came from the study guides, but I will be changing them a little bit, and I'll discuss that as we talk about the questions. But the other questions, the ones that come from the first three exams, those will not be reworded at all. So let's jump into it. Genetic drift is the result of what? And that is very simply chance, right? So remember, when we're genetic drift, we're talking about the change in the population, right? It's not natural selection. It's not like where the best trait gets passed on. It's just happens by chance. And the example we used, what was it? Or the examples I used in lecture were like a chin dimple, right? There is no advantage for humans to have a chin dimple, but the percentage of people who have a chin dimple probably changes from, generation to generation, not because there's any advantage to it, just because that is the way it is. So you can see there, the answer is chance. So genetic drift is the result of chance. And obviously, I'm going to reword that, but basically you just need to know the definition of genetic drift. So any questions about that?
No.
All right. The next one is, which of the following is an example that results from directional selection? I don't like the way your book wrote this. I don't like these options they gave you. They're a little bit vague. So I am going to most likely reword these questions to where they're less vague and more like the example that we used in lecture. If you remember in lecture, we talked about a population of mice. There was light mice, there was dark mice, and then there was everything in between. And then the majority of that population was that middle colored mice, right? That's what we started with. And then when we talked about directional selection, that means it went to one extreme phenotype or the other. So in that example, that means the population went from, having mostly middle colored mice to either mostly dark colored or mostly light colored, right? That would be directional selection. That's when you're going to one extreme phenotype or the other. That being said, the answer to this is there is an increase in antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria, because that would be a phenotype, right? You're either completely resistant to the antibiotics, or you're completely susceptible to the antibiotics on the other hand. Or, of course, in the middle, there would be the bacteria that are, kind of susceptible and kind of not. So that's the answer. And again, I would reword that so make it less ambiguous. So any questions about that one?
No.
All right. The next one. This one's actually pretty simple. If the frequency of one allele in a population is 0.7, what is the frequency of the other allele? Excuse me. And remember, it all equals 1. So if 1 is 0.7, then the other one has to be 0.3 because 0.7 plus 0.3 equals 1. If you remember the equation, it was P plus Q equals 1. So if P is 0.7, then Q must be 0.3. That's all it is for the exam. I'm going to change the numbers, but either way, just remember it needs to add up to 1. Any questions about that?
No.
All right. And again, while I'm doing this, I'm just going through this and double checking to make sure I have it marked as the correct answer. I'm doing double duty here. Which of the following can create new alleles? Anybody have a guess on that one?
Mutation?
Perfect. Yes. Mutation is the only thing that can create new alleles. Natural selection wouldn't happen without mutation. So, I can see why somebody would have that word in their brain. Sexual reproduction, again, is part of natural selection. But yeah, mutation is the answer. Genetic drift is probably, I don't want to say that anyway. Never mind. The answer is mutation. So when I reword this one, I'll probably just change some of the choices. And like I've been doing in the past 2 exams, I'll probably throw in some answers that make absolutely no sense. Like I might just throw in a word that I made up. And if you guess that one, then you'll lose more points, right? So if you guess mutation, I'll come back to that. Which of the following is a component of the fossil record? This one should be easy. You're just guessing. You're looking at all these things, and which of these is a fossil? The similarity of 4 limbs of cats and bats? No, that's not a fossil. That's just you looking at living animals. The bones of extinct whales. There you go. That's the answer, right? Because they're extinct and they're bones. There you go. That's a fossil. Obviously, that's not going to be one of the choices in the exam. Probably, I'm going to change it to something else. Just go back to the lecture, go back to the book, and look at all the different types of fossils. Right? There's bones. There's impressions. There's fossilized poop. Remember the coprolites. So just know what a fossil is, right? Or even if you don't know what a fossil is, just know what a fossil is not, right? Because it's a multiple choice exam. Any questions about that one?
No.
Okay. Actually, let me make sure I've got the right answer. Yep. Okay. The similarity of the embryos of fish, frogs, birds, whatever. If we're talking about similarity, the key here is similarity of embryos. The rest of the question almost doesn't even matter. If we're talking about the similarity of embryos, the answer is common ancestry, right? We didn't really talk about analogy. Genetic drift has nothing to do with this, and neither does decreased genetic variation. So if we're looking at the similarities, and if hopefully you remember the example where I showed a picture of a fish embryo, a chicken embryo, and a human embryo, and they all look very similar, right? At the very early stages, they look similar. That's what we're getting at. It's evidence of common ancestry. Pretty straightforward. All right, the next one. Which of the following is a characteristic of a population at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? And that's the key there. Equilibrium means there's no change, right? That means things are static, not changing. Therefore, this should be pretty easy. The answer is the population is not evolving. Because if the population was subject to natural selection, obviously it is evolving. If genetic drift was occurring, it is evolving. Like we said earlier, genetic drift is the change of a population by chance. It's microevolution. Same thing with gene flow, right? That's the change of the gene pool. That is still evolution. So obviously, one of these things is not like the other. The other 3 choices involve a change, and this is the only one that involves no change. So there you go. Any questions about that one?
No.
Okay. The original, I think I've already talked about this. I don't remember. I just graded or left feedback for a study guide. So I'm trying to remember if I've already said this in this video or if I said this in the feedback. But anyway, the original source of genetic variation that serves as the raw material for natural selection is mutation. That's it. It is mutation. Because remember, when we're talking about natural selection, we're talking about one allele winning out over another allele, right? If we're talking about genes, like this version of the gene is more beneficial than that version, That's natural selection. And to get different versions of a gene, you have to have mutation. That's where the different versions come from. So that's the answer. Yeah. So any questions about that one?
No.
All right. Natural selection generally results in what? Increased genetic variation? Not necessarily. A population that's better adapted to a future environment? No way, because we
No.
don't know what the future holds. A population that is adapted to the current environment? Yes, that is
Yes.
the answer. And no, not necessarily an increase in the population size either. So none of these are glaringly wrong. But the answer is, well, okay, maybe the future environment thing is glaringly wrong. But the answer is a population that is adapted to its current environment. Yeah, that one's pretty simple. There's not much I could do to reword that one. I'll do my best, but that one won't look too much different on the final. Natural selection can be defined as blank. And again, there's not much I can do to reword this, but I'll do my best. But it should look similar on the exam. The production of more offspring that can survive? No. That's one of the things you need for natural selection to occur, but that's not how you define it. A process in which organisms with certain inherited traits are more likely to survive, and you can't see the rest, and reproduce and pass along the genes. Boom. Yes, that is the answer. A process in which changes in gene frequency results from evolution. That's usually, that is one of the things that can happen in natural selection, but that's not the best answer. Obviously, I've already told you the best answer. And again, maybe, hold on. Sorry, I'm starting to second guess myself. Let me look at this. Maybe there's something I'm missing here. The traits. Okay. Anyway, and then you can see here, the fourth choice is the evolution of a population of organisms. And that's close to being the correct answer, right? Because natural selection is a type of evolution, but remember, it is just one type. So this answer is the best answer because it's most specific. We're talking about certain organisms surviving because they have certain traits, and because of them surviving, they have a higher chance of reproducing. So that is the answer. And I want to make sure you guys understand that before I move forward, because this is probably the trickiest one we've had so far, because the rest of them, like I said, that's a pretty close second. So any questions on that one?
No.
All right. In the Hardy-Weinberg formula, what does 2pq represent? So remember, it was p squared plus 2pq plus q squared. And the first thing we need to know before we talk specifically about 2pq is that all of those, whether it's p squared or q squared or 2pq, all of those represent genotypes. And if you remember the way we studied it, there's only 3 different genotypes. There's homozygous dominant, there's homozygous recessive, and there's heterozygous. Or hell, we could even simplify it even more. There's only 2 different types of there's only 2 genotypes. There's either heterozygous or homozygous, right? Now, granted, you could subcategorize the homozygous to dominant or recessive, but you're either heterozygous or you're homozygous. And in this one, you just need to remember that 2pq, that is the heterozygotes. Now, this is one of those questions. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and do it now. This question is going to be worth a little bit more because if you were to guess homozygous, at least you're close, right? If you were to guess, no, that's it. If you were to guess homozygous dominant, you'd get partial credit. If you guess recessive allele or dominant allele, you're getting 0 credit. Because remember, with this formula, p squared plus 2pq plus q squared, we're talking about genotypes, not alleles. So I want to give credit where credit's due, at least if you guess homozygous dominant, or as I reword it, homozygous recessive, or even just homozygous. If you guess that, I will give you partial credit because at least you're on the right track and you're talking about a genotype as opposed to an allele. Is that clear for everybody?
Yes.
Okay, good. So again, heterozygotes will be worth 2 points. Anything else, any other genotype would be worth 1 point. And of course, for the exam, I might change this. I might say, what does p squared represent? Or what does q squared represent? In which case, the answer would be just homozygous. I wouldn't even make you remember dominant or recessive. Who cares? Just homozygous. All right. Which of the following statements is true? Let's look through them. Natural selection works on variation already present in a population. That's pretty simple. Yeah. Think about the moths, right? There was no natural selection until that random mutation. And then all of a sudden you had variation, right? You had light moths, dark moths, The variation was there. Natural selection chose the dark moth. So that's the answer. Natural selection works on non-heritable traits. That is incorrect, because if you can't inherit it, it doesn't matter. So moths that were dark because they were covered in soot, that didn't matter, right? If it was a light moth that was covered in soot and therefore it survived, that's not going to matter, because the fact that it was covered in soot was not a heritable trait. Individuals evolve through natural selection. That is incorrect because of the word individuals. Individuals do not evolve. Only populations evolve. Same thing here. Individual organisms evolve structures that they need. And again, these two would be wrong because individuals don't evolve. So that's the answer. For the exam, I'll probably change it. I might make this one say natural selection works on variation that will be present in a future population, which would make that wrong, right? Because it doesn't work on the future. It's only in the current. And then I might make this one say natural selection works on heritable traits, which would make this one correct. So as you're studying, know that I'm going to change one of these to make it correct. And I'm going to probably change this one to make it incorrect. So any questions about that?
No.
All right. I'm hoping I'm not talking too quiet, but one of my daughters is taking a nap, so I'm trying to keep it down. Anyway, on The Origin of Species, which is that book that Darwin wrote, he argued that the mechanism of descent with modification was natural selection. This is pretty simple. Remember, artificial selection is something he considered when he came up with his theory, but he didn't propose that artificial selection was how we have all these different species. He said it's natural selection. He definitely didn't say it's an inheritance of acquired characteristics. That was something that Lamarck said. And then here's a word that has absolutely nothing to do with this. As a matter of fact, right now I'm going to change it. This one is now worth 2 points. And anybody who guesses any of these three things at least is on the right track. And then so they will get, if you guess natural selection, you'll get 2 points. If you guess these other two, you'll get 1 point. And if you guess this other one that's completely made up, you will get 0 points. Any questions?
Nope.
All right. Gene flow. This should be simple. I hope it is. We're talking about microevolution here. We're talking about the changes of a gene pool. And what accomplishes this? Migration. It's in the name, right? That's when the genes flow from one population to another. And I think I used examples of either lakes or islands or something like that, where we had these populations of the same species, but the populations were separated from each other, generally speaking. But sometimes they would come in contact with each other, and therefore genes would flow from one population to the other. Now, you wouldn't even have the variation for the genes to flow without mutation, so don't let that fool you. But the answer is migration. Migration is how genes flow from one population to the next. Which of the following examples results from disruptive selection? I talked about this earlier, how I don't like the way your book wrote this question and how I'm going to make it a little bit easier when I reword it. In disruptive selection, hopefully you can picture this in your mind. Again, we were talking about the mice, and we had a population of mice. Some of them were really dark, some of them were really light, but most of them were right there in the middle. In disruptive selection, what you do is you're getting more genetic variation, and you're getting less of that middle. So in this case, you would have more dark, more light, but fewer of the middle, right? So try to picture in your brain that graph where there's one big hump in the middle, a bell curve. But with disruptive selection, then you ended up with 2 bell curves. So in this case, the best option is there's an increase in the number of dog breeds. But again, I'm going to change that because I'm going to make it more obvious. This one, I don't like the way your book wrote this. Just make sure you understand what disruptive selection is. You're getting rid of that middle ground phenotype. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay, what does evolutionary fitness measure? Now, this one's a little bit tricky if you're in a rush, but if you're not in a rush and you're actually reading through it, you should be okay. Evolutionary fitness measures the reproductive success, relative reproductive success. Meaning, if we're looking at a blue-footed booby, for example, which one reproduced more than the other? And if you're reproducing more than the others in your population, that means you're passing along your genes more than the others in the population. Therefore, you have a high evolutionary fitness. Now, to reproduce more, it would be good to have good physical health. It would be good to have longevity. And you might argue that good reproductive success would increase the population size. I don't know, but I could see why somebody might guess the first two. But the answer is relative reproductive success. Any questions about that?
No.
All right. Which of the following is not a requirement of natural selection? Differential reproductive success? Nope, that is definitely a requirement. We just talked about that, right? So because you have to have some that are better at reproducing than others, because those are the traits that are whatever traits those individuals had, those are going to be what's passed down in natural selection. Overproduction of offspring. We didn't talk about it much, but we did talk about that in lecture. That is one of the requirements. You need to have a struggle to survive. That way, it's only those that are best fit for the environment that do survive. Genetic variation, yep, you have to have that, because if everything's the same, there's nothing to choose from. Like if I said, well, yeah, let's just leave it at that. Gene flow, that's definitely not it, right? Again, gene flow is just genes flowing from one population to the next. So yeah, the answer is gene flow, right? Gene flow is the only thing that is not a requirement of natural selection. And hopefully the way you can remember that, and I'll change it up. I might say genetic drift. It might say founder effect. It might say some complete garbage. But at least with gene flow, hopefully you remember that that's microevolution, and that was a different form of evolution. So remember, evolution includes things like natural selection, and separately gene flow, and separately sexual selection, and separately natural selection. So gene flow is, again, that's why it's the wrong answer, because it doesn't even fall under natural selection. It is a completely different category of evolution. All right. And most developed, that's the key word. Actually, the ED right there, developed countries, that's the key. The overall population growth rates, what? They are, if we're talking about developed countries, that's like where we live in, the United States, they are near zero. So the population size is fairly stable. So America is a great example for that. Our population is growing, but it's not much. We're mostly just replacing humans in developed countries. There's not much else to say about that. It's just something you have to memorize. Yeah. Any questions about that?
Okay. No.
All right. Oh yeah, this one. You know what? Let me change this one too again. Whoops. Because I'm going to change this one to 2 points, because this answer is so bad that you will, at least maybe if you guess the other ones, you get 1 point. If you guess this one, you get 0 points. If the population growth was high, then the population size certainly wouldn't be fairly stable, right? It would be increasing. So that one's way off. So you'll lose extra points for that. Yeah, that's it. All right. An unexpected freeze that kills a population of chipmunks is an example of what? This is hopefully pretty simple. It is an example of a density independent factor, right? It doesn't matter if let's just change it to squirrels, since that's the example I kept using in the lecture. It doesn't matter if there's one squirrel on WVSU's campus or if there's 1,000 squirrels on WVSU's campus. If it's so cold that it would kill any squirrel, then 100% of the squirrels are going to die, right? Doesn't matter how many there are. So the answer is density independent. Obviously, for the exam, it will not be a freeze and it will not be a chipmunk, but there will be a question where I give you a situation and where, something kills something off and the population density has nothing to do with it. And that would be a density independent factor. And again, I'm going to change this one to be worth 2 points. If you were to guess density independent or density dependent, at least you're on the right track, because those are the only two real choices, dependent or independent. So if you guess anything else, you're going to lose extra points. All right. Over time, the population of most species does what? And the answer is it fluctuates. It's pretty simple. It doesn't increase rapidly and then crash and never recover. Otherwise, most species wouldn't be here. It doesn't continually increase. We know that, right? That's impossible, generally speaking. And I can see why somebody might guess exhibit boom and bust cycles, because at least that is something we talked about. We did give an example of boom and bust, but No, the answer is fluctuate. Generally speaking, most populations fluctuate. Maybe not wildly, because if they fluctuated wildly, that would be boom and bust. But try to picture my cursor, what my cursor is doing here. Remember, it goes up, and then remember it was like hit carrying capacity when it kind of looked like a wave up and down the carrying capacity. So that's the answer to that one. Opportunistic species typically do what? Are long living? Nope. Have a large number of offspring? Yes. Reach sexual maturity slowly? No. Exhibit type 1 survivorship curve? No. The answer is have large number of offspring. Not only should you memorize, should you know that from what you've learned in the lecture and read in the book, you should know that opportunistic species have a large number of offspring. But another thing you should notice is one of these things is not like the other. The other three describe a completely different type of organism. The other three talk about the opposite, which is a equilibrial life history. They live long, they reach sexual maturity slowly, they exhibit a type 1 survivorship curve, they have few well cared for offspring, right? So you should know that this is the answer because one of these things is not like the other. Likewise, when you're studying this, keep in mind the answer might not be have a large number of offspring. It could be something like are very short lived, reach sexual maturity, can't speak, reach sexual maturity very quickly, exhibit a type 3 survivorship curve. So keep in mind, obviously, I'm going to change it up. You just need to know, you need to be able to recognize an opportunistic species. So, any questions about that one? Okay. Oh yeah, before I move on, obviously I should have said this at the beginning. Obviously, you guys are here on your own time. It's a Saturday afternoon. So you can come and go as you please. You can just leave this meeting if you want. It doesn't matter to me. I'm here for you, and this is being recorded. So don't feel like you're obliged to stay here. I'm fine with talking to myself. I'm recording it. So do what you have to do. Anyway, next question. Which of these factors operates on a density dependent manner? So the last one we talked about was density independent. Now we're talking about the opposite of it. And you can see too, it's kind of asked in a different way. And of course, I'll change it up. But let's look at the answer. Blizzard? No, a blizzard doesn't care if there's one squirrel on WVSU's campus or 1,000, right? A blizzard's just going to kill everything, assuming the blizzard was bad enough. Same with a volcanic eruption, right? It's just going to kill everything in its path. It doesn't matter how density dependent it is. Food supply? Yep. There's your answer, right? Because the more densely populated something is, the more they are fighting for the food resources. Therefore, food supply is a density dependent manner. And of course, flood obviously is a density independent manner because a flood will just kill anything that's in its path, they can't swim. So again, for the exam, I'm going to reword it, but you just need to know, you need to be able to recognize the density dependent factor when you see it. Any questions?
Nope.
All right. Integrated pest management. It favors overwhelming pests with chemical pesticides? Nope. The key word there being overwhelming, right? Because remember we said for integrated pest management, like you kind of tolerated a little bit, a small amount of pests. So you wouldn't want to overwhelm anything. Same with this. You wouldn't want to totally eradicate. Remember, that's one of the things about integrated pest management. You deal with a little bit. Aims to keep populations on an exponential growth curve. Obviously, that's bad. That's the opposite of what you're doing. You still are trying to reduce the population, so you don't want to do the opposite and have it on an exponential growth curve. That therefore leaves only this, which advocates mixed species planting and rotating crops. Because remember, sometimes these pests are very specific. There might be some insects that only eat soy. So if you grow soy one year and then the next year you grow corn, then all those pests that only ate soy, they're gone, right? They just disappear. Of course, now you're going to have a corn pest, but then again, you rotate it next year and then that thing's gone. So that's the answer. And again, just familiarize yourself with integrated pest management, because I will give you probably some other thing that integrated pest management advocates. Or I might even change this, right? I might put advocates partial eradication of pest species, in which case that would be the correct answer. So as usual, that's how it will go. I'll change the options around. All right, the next one, ecological footprint of the United States. This should be easy since you've learned about it in lecture and you learned about it in the lab. About the same as the global average? No. Lower than the global average? Definitely not. Shows that Americans consume a disproportionate amount of food and fuel. That is correct.
Yep.
And shows that the population size is increasing slowly. No. So yeah, the answer is this. Shows that Americans consume a disproportionate amount of food and fuel. Let me make sure I have that correct. Yep. All right. Here we go. We've talked about this earlier. Type 1 survivorship. Now, who wrote this? Who's making these rules? Who's categorizing type 1, type 2, type 3? It's humans, human scientists. And because it's humans making these categorizations, then obviously humans are going to put themselves number one. So when you're getting a question about type 1, you should think about humans. So basically, which of these applies to humans? Intermediate number of offspring, intermediate level of parental care? No. Few offspring and good parental care? Yes, that is type 1. Generally speaking, they have few offspring and good parental care. The opposite, obviously, is not correct. We don't have many offspring. Oh, this would be, you know what? This would be worth fewer points because you're not going to have many offspring and good parental care. You would have many offspring and poor parental care, like this one. So let me change this one up. This one, many offspring and good parental care, would be worth fewer points now. And again, I'm going to change it up. So just make sure you know what type 1 survivorship is. Few offspring, good parental care, slowly mature. What else? Likely to survive. You know, the young are likely to survive, and you're likely to hit a certain age towards the end. And then after that, your chances of surviving rapidly decrease, right? So and humans are, as the example, are likely to live to be old age, but then once you start hitting that certain age of old age, then we start dropping off like flies. So any questions about that? All right. Blank is the maximum population size that a particular habitat can support. There's not much else to say about this other than the fact that it's carrying capacity, right? Carrying capacity is the maximum population size that a particular habitat can support. There's not much I'll do my best to reword it, but there's not much I could do for that. Which of these best describes a type 3 survivorship? So just remember, type 3 is opposite of type 1. And while we're at it, type 2 is the one that splits the middle. So type 3 is the opposite of us. High survivorship for the very young? No, that's type 1. Like I was saying earlier, you know, most humans survive when they're very young. They don't start dying until they're old. Most individuals survive to older age intervals. Nope. These two things go hand in hand. Survivorship is constant over the lifespan. No, that's type 2. And then here we go. Survivorship is high for the few individuals that survive to a certain age. That is the answer. Remember, type 3, they're all about just throwing out a bunch of offspring and seeing which ones make it. So think about like a dandelion with all those tiny little seeds. Each one of those is a little baby plant, basically, and most of them aren't going to make it. Or think about sea turtles where they drop off hundreds of eggs, and then you have that big swarm of little baby sea turtles rushing the ocean. Only a few of them are going to make it. So for type 3, most individuals die at a young age. But if you make it past that certain age, then you're probably going to be okay for a while. And again, for the exam, I'll probably change it. So I might say there is low survivorship for the very young, in which case that would be the answer. Or, most of it, I don't like that one. Anyway, yeah, so I could change it up. Just know what type 3 survivorship is. Any questions? All right. Okay, make sure I had that right. In an ideal unlimited environment, what shape does the population's growth curve most likely resemble? I like this question because in a way it's a two-part question. The first thing you need to ask yourself is, what kind of population growth model are we talking about? If it's an ideal unlimited environment, then that means we are talking about exponential growth. And then that's the first information you need. And then you need to remember, okay, if it's exponential growth, what is the shape of the graph? It is a J shape. Remember, it starts off, it goes straight up. So the answer is J. And I'm going to make this worth 2 points because at least if you guess S, that was one of the other options because that was the logistic growth, right? Was S shaped. Now, these two things, never even talked about them. Those are random things, and if you guess those, you're going to lose more points. All right. What is the population? We've said this so many times in the past few weeks. A group of organisms that occupies the same general area at a different time? No, this is wrong for a few reasons. First of all, a group of organisms, that's too broad. That's not specific enough. That has to be the same species. Same general area? That's good. But at a different time? No. So, for example, the humans that live in West Virginia right now are a separate population than the humans that lived in West Virginia in 1780, right? That's not the same population because it was a different time. A group of individuals of a single species that occupies the same general area at the same time. There we go. That's the answer. Same species, same area, same time. The growth rate of individuals. Now, I'm not even going to finish that, right? The growth rate, that's wrong right away. And again, same with this. The growth rate. We know that's wrong. That's just way off because it's nothing to do with growth rate. It's just a group. It's a group. We know at least, the very least, a population is a group, but it's a group of what? So again, here we go. This one's going to be worth more points because at least if you guess a group of something, you're going to get partial credit. If you guess these two, you're going to get 0 credit. All right. In most developing countries, now think about it. We've already had this question in a way, but we talked about developed countries. Now we're talking about countries that are currently developing. Birth rates equal death rates, so the population is fairly stable. Nope. That actually describes developed countries like our own. Birth rates are lower than death rates, so the population is declining. That is not the case. Birth rates are lower than death rates, so the population is growing rapidly. No, not only is that incorrect, but that wouldn't even happen. If birth rates were lower than death rates, then the population would be declining, like this one says. And then, of course, the next one, birth rates are much higher than death rates, so the population is growing rapidly. That is the correct answer. And again, this is going to be worth extra points because if you guess birth rates are lower than death rates, so the population is growing, you're going to lose more points. Because not only is it incorrect for the answer, but it's just an incorrect statement. That's just not how it would happen. Are there any questions so far? All right. Competition among individuals of the same species. There's the key word there. So they're in the same species. What is it? It is intraspecific, right? And really the only options here, the only thing you really have to choose from are intraspecific or interspecific. The other three are just words that have nothing to do with this. They're just words that we happen to learn in the same chapter. So again, this is going to be worth extra points because at least if you guess intraspecific or interspecific, you're on the right track. But if you guess density independent, type 1, type 2, type 3, or any other word other than these two, you're going to get 0 credit. All right. Non-native species, aka invasive species. Well, I don't have time to get into it. Anyway, non-native species can have important effects on biological communities by what? Preying upon native species? Yep. Competing with them? Yep. Reducing biodiversity? Yep. So the answer is all of the above. That one's pretty straightforward. Which of these best describes type 2? We've already talked about this. This is the only one. We've already talked about survivorship curves. We've talked about type 1. We've talked about type 3. Therefore, out of the process of elimination, this is the only one left. So remember, type 2 kind of splits the middle between type 1 and type 3. So high survivorship for the very young? No, that's type 1. Most individuals survive to an older age? No, that's type 1. Survivorship is constant over the lifespan? Yes, that is the answer. And obviously, survivorship is high for the few individuals that survive to a certain age. No, that is type 3. So there we go. Pretty simple. The answer is survivorship is constant over the lifespan. Species that exhibit an equilibrial life history. Yes, that is misspelled. No, I'm not going to fix it. If you want to know why, we can talk about it after Bio 101 is done. There's a method to my madness, but I don't want to give it away right now. Anyway, species that exhibit an equilibrial life history do what? Have long lives? Yes. Exhibit a type 3 survivorship? No, because it's a type 1. Again, obviously it's not type 2 because it's type 1. Large number of offspring? No, that's describing a type 3. That's describing an opportunistic life history, which we've already had a question on. So the answer is has long lives. And again, I'll probably change this. So the answer probably won't be have long lives. It'll probably be some other thing that describes equilibrium life history, like has a small number of offspring or exhibits a type 1 survivorship curve or reaches sexual maturity slowly or has few, well, I already talked about that, has well cared for offspring, any of the above. Any questions so far? All right, this one's pretty straightforward. Herbivory is an example of what kind of interaction. Think about it. It should be pretty easy. If something is eating a plant, it's good for the thing doing the eating. It's bad for the plant, generally speaking. Therefore, it is a plus negative. Pretty simple. There's not much else I can say about that. Ooh, I'm glad I checked. Look at that. The answer is plus negative, not neutral and plus. So that's fixed. The single greatest threat to biodiversity comes from what? Remember, we talked about this. The answer is habitat destruction and fragmentation. And remember, the way I said you can remember that is because all these other things, when you think about it, kind of feed into this. What do invasive species do? They destroy habitats. What does overexploitation do? It destroys habitats. What does pollution do? It destroys habitats. So the answer is habitat destruction and fragmentation. Any questions so far? All right. At this point, we have covered 36 questions. So 36 questions on the final exam are going to come from chapters 13, 19, and 20. The other 4 makes it 40. 64 questions are going to come from exams 1, exams 2, exams 3. And that is what we're about to talk about. Now, to remind you, everything above this came from the study guides. So everything above this will be reworded. Everything below this is from your old exams, so it's going to look just like you see it. It's not going to be reworded. It is going to be verbatim. They will not be changed. Here we go. What keeps a single water molecule together? People can constantly get this wrong. The answer is covalent bonds. It is a covalent bond that keeps the oxygen connected to the 2 hydrogens. That is the answer. I'm going to make this worth more points because at least if you guess hydrogen bonds or ionic bonds, you're at least guessing something we talked about. Obviously, it's not glue. And polar bonds, we talked about polar molecules, but we didn't talk about polar bonds. There are no polar bonds. So again, if you get to 2 points if you get it correct, 1 point if you at least guess one of the bonds we talked about, 0 points if you guess any of that other garbage. Cellulose is an example of what? The answer is polysaccharide. Yeah, polysaccharide. Make sure I got the right one there. So remember, a steroid is an example of a lipid. A monosaccharide is, well, it's just a monosaccharide. A polypeptide, an example of a monosaccharide would be glucose. An example of a steroid would be estrogen. An example of a polypeptide, well, those are just proteins. So, yeah, cellulose is an example of polysaccharide. That's pretty straightforward. What is the name given to a reaction that breaks peptide bonds? I like this question. It's supposed to be a little bit tricky. The word that's supposed to make it tricky for you is the fact that it says peptides. But think about this. You can completely erase that number if you want, that word. What we could say is, what is the name given to reactions that break bonds? Any bonds that we have talked about in this class. Whenever we're talking about breaking a bond in this course, it has always been hydrolysis. Hydrolysis breaks bonds. Any questions so far?
No.
All right. Here's one that people missed a lot because they memorized it from the study guide, and I made one slight change, and that threw people off. Beryllium's atomic mass is 9. Its atomic number is 4. How many neutrons are found in a beryllium atom? Well, if its atomic number is 4, that means it has 4 protons. So we know its total mass is 9, and we know that the total mass is protons plus neutrons. So 4 plus what equals 9? The answer is 5. 4 plus 5 equals 9. Now, I'm going to change this one too. Not the wording, because I won't do that. But If anybody guesses 4.5, you're going to lose extra points because when we're talking about atomic mass and proton numbers and neutron numbers, we never, ever used a decimal. So there we go. Next question. Which of these is in the correct order? This one's a little bit tricky because I told you to memorize the scientific method. But usually if you did it right, you memorize the whole thing, and that might throw some people off because even though what the correct answer is in the correct order, it's not the whole thing. But anyway, that being said, let's look at our choices here. Observation, question, prediction, hypothesis. Almost correct, but the prediction and the hypothesis are swapped. Remember, you come up with a hypothesis first, and then you come up with multiple predictions to test your hypothesis. Experiment, observation, conclusion, incorrect. Now, any Joe off the street taking this exam might think that's correct because you might, in the sense, that's almost logical. You do an experiment, you observe what happens in the experiment, and then you come to a conclusion. But remember, that's not the answer. Question, prediction, conclusion, that is the correct answer, right? Because you question, you observe something, then you have a question, then you have a hypothesis, then you have a prediction, then you perform an experiment, then you come to a conclusion. So again, there's things missing, but it is in the correct order. So, glad I checked that. There we go. So the answer is question, prediction, conclusion. Any questions about that?
No.
All right. And of course, this one, hypothesis, prediction, question. The hypothesis and the prediction are in the correct order. The question is out of order. All right, you try to vacuum your room, but your cordless vacuum won't turn on. Which of the following is a hypothesis? Remember, a hypothesis is it's a way of testing, right? It's a statement. It's a tentative answer that you can actually test. So if it won't turn on and you say to yourself the battery isn't inserted properly, yeah, that's a hypothesis, right? That's a tentative answer because the question is, why won't it turn on? Well, the answer might be the battery isn't inserted properly. And you could test that by reinserting the battery. Why won't it turn on? That's a question, not a hypothesis. If I make a wish, it will turn on. No. First of all, you can't really test that necessarily. You could argue that maybe you could test that, but that's a prediction. Generally speaking, if it's an if-then statement or if it starts with an if in our course, it's a prediction. I have such bad luck. No, you can't test that, right? That is a tentative explanation, but you can't test it. You can't falsify that. So that's not it. If I reinstate the battery, it will turn on. No, that is a prediction based on that hypothesis. So there you go. As a matter of fact, again, this will be worth extra points. The correct answer is the battery isn't inserted properly. I'll at least give partial credit if you choose the prediction that's based on that hypothesis, because at least you're on the right track, because you can test this, and that is a tentative explanation. So, but the best answer is the battery isn't inserted properly. Next, a fat that is completely hydrogenated would be what? Well, if it's hydrogenated, that means it's hydrogenated with hydrogen bonds, which means it's completely saturated, which means it's completely straight, right? There's no kinks in it, so to speak, which means it can stack up on itself nice and neat, which means it can stay solid at room temperature. Therefore, the answer is saturated and solid at room temperature. And I'm going to up the points here. Nah, no, I won't. Never mind. So that's the answer: saturated, and at and solid at room temperature. I was going to up the points, but these are all. Hold on. Let me think about this. Unsaturated and solid. Yeah. See, all of them have something correct because unsaturated is incorrect. Solid is correct. Again, saturated is correct. Here we go. Unsaturated and liquid. That is very incorrect. So yeah, I will change this. This is going to be worth 2 points. So basically, as long as you don't choose this one, you're going to at least get partial credit. Let me think about this. Unsaturated. No, I'm sorry. I'll explain later if you want me to, but let's just move forward. Which substance is hydrophilic? Again, one of these things is not like the other. Here we have a lipid, not a lipid, right? Starch is a polysaccharide. Starch is hydrophilic. The rest are hydrophobic. The answer is starch. Blank is a steroid. Whoop. Interesting. Same kind of thing. But we know butter, hopefully, is a fat. Hopefully, you know that. Maltose, hopefully, you remember, is a monosaccharide, or excuse me, a carbohydrate. Sucrose, also a carbohydrate. Estrogen is the answer. Estrogen is a steroid. Good. What happens if you change the number of neutrons in an atom? Well, if you change the number of protons, you change the element. If you change the number of electrons, you have an ion. Um, so if you change the number of neutrons, you make an isotope. There we go. Pretty simple. There's not much I can say about that. It's not going to be reworded because it's from the first or second exam. Nucleic acids are polymers of what? The answer is simply nucleotide. It's pretty simple. Now we'll make this one worth more. At least if you guess DNA or RNA, I mean, you got it backwards. Nucleic acids are not polymers of RNA and DNA, but at least RNA and DNA are made from nucleic acids. So at least you're not completely insane if you guess those two. But if you guess monosaccharides, you're way off base. So you'll get 0 points for that. A fat contains which components? This one's pretty simple. Well, I shouldn't say it's simple because all those choices are pretty similar. The answer is simply 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol molecule. I guess the only advice I can give you to remember that is the name of a fat. A fat is a triglyceride. So if you can remember tri, hopefully that'll help you remember 3 fatty acids. Milk's pH is 6. Which of the following is a correct statement? Let's see. Milk has 10 times more OH ions than water. Let's think about this. If its pH is 6, that means it's more acidic than water because water is 7. So if it's more acidic, it doesn't have more OH ions. It has more H plus ions. So it's not that. 10 times more acidic. Yes, because every time you take a step down, it is a 10-fold change. So from 7 to 6, that is the answer. And this is the opposite of true. Opposite of true. It's not more basic because you went down the pH scale, not up. So the answer is, whoops. See, I'm glad I'm checking these. 10 times more acidic than water. All right, next one. This comes from the syllabus. This is from exam 1 or 2. I don't remember which one. There's not much to say about this. If you don't know this at this point, we're in trouble. Not that it matters because independent work is past due, but it is worth 100 points. Good. What do you call a bond between oppositely charged atoms? Well, let me ask you this. What do you call charged atoms? They are ions. Therefore, the answer is ionic bond. And again, there's that polar bond, a word that is made up. So again, I'm going to up this. You at least get partial credit as long as you don't guess polar bond. So, so far I'm doing a lot of these on this exam. So hopefully people will be okay because, here you only you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting 0 credit. In other words, you have a 3 in 4 chance of at least getting some credit. So hopefully this helps. What type of fatty acid has double bonds? So if it's has double bonds, that means it does not have all the hydrogen atoms that it could. Because if it did have all the hydrogen atoms that it could, it wouldn't have double bonds. Therefore, it is unsaturated. An atom is basically defined by what? I kind of hinted at this a couple questions ago. The answer is protons. If you change the number of protons, you change the element. So that's simply the answer to that. Which of the following is or are the products of this reaction? So we have glucose plus fructose gives us water plus sucrose. It could be any words. It doesn't matter. Here we have an arrow going from left to right. Anything on the left are the reactants. Anything on the right are the products. And we are asking about the products. So the answer is water and sucrose. So there you go. There's the answer. Water and sucrose. Again, I'm going to make this worth more points. At least if you guess glucose and fructose, at least you guess something on the same side. So you get partial credit for that. If you guess fructose and water, you're going to get 0 credit because those are all different sides. Same with glucose and sucrose, completely different sides of the equation. So you're way off base if you guess those two. What happens when water freezes? Well, hopefully you know that it floats. And what makes something float? It's less dense. How did it become less dense? Well, the atoms moved farther apart. The molecules moved farther apart. So the answer is the molecules moved farther apart. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Not much else to say about that one. What is biology? Good grief. let's just make this one worth extra points just because it's so easy. And if you don't know, that's like the one most important question of the semester when you think about it, because that's what we were studying. It is the scientific study of life. I guess I give you partial credit if you guess study of life, but nothing for anything else. Yes, cells are the unit of life, but it's not necessarily the study of cells because look at the stuff we studied at the end. We were talking about evolution and ecology and populations, right? That's not cells that we're talking about. We're not even organisms. We're looking at multiple organisms and things like that. So anyway, that's pretty straightforward. Not much else to say about that. What name is given to this reaction? Galactose plus glucose gives us lactose plus water. Here's the key. We have water on the right side of the equation. What we have done here is we've brought two molecules together, and in the process, we have produced water. In a sense, you could almost say we've squeezed water out of the reactants. Therefore, we have dehydrated it. The answer is dehydration reaction. If water is on the right-hand side of the equation, it is a dehydration reaction. Or if you're really, really smart and have a great memory, you might remember that glucose and galactose are monosaccharides and lactose is a disaccharide. And if you do, hopefully what you do need to remember, though, is that when you bring two things together, that is a dehydration reaction. So if you can remember monosaccharide plus monosaccharide is a disaccharide, that's a dehydration reaction. This will be worth more points because the only true options really are dehydration and hydrolysis. Polymer and protein have absolutely nothing to do with this. So you will get 0 credit for guessing those two. You'll at least get partial credit for guessing hydrolysis. Whew, here's the part where people started missing stuff. Photosynthesis and respiration. Which produces oxygen? Now let's just talk about how oxygen is produced. We need electrons for this process. Where do the electrons come from? They come from the water. Water's like, hey, here's an electron. And when it gives it up, essentially, we then get a molecule of of oxygen. So basically the question is, in which process does water give up an electron? And that is the light reaction. The answer is light reactions. And this is going to be worth 2 points because the only thing we talked about for photosynthesis were light reactions and Calvin cycle. Anything else has nothing to do with photosynthesis, and you will lose extra points just like you did on the original exam, and it broke my heart. When people chose something other than light reactions and Calvin cycle, they lost more points. I did it to help. I was like, hopefully they'll just at least remember the only two options for photosynthesis are glycolysis, light reactions and Calvin cycle. But anyway, that's that. Photosynthesis, which uses water. Well, we just talked about that because water is the thing that gives up the electrons, and that's what gives us the oxygen. So the answer is light reactions. Again, we're worth extra points there. Photosynthesis, which directly produces glucose. So remember, light reactions and Calvin cycle are the only options. Light reactions are all about getting that energy, right? Because the Calvin cycle, that's the thing. That is our sugar factory, so to speak. So it needs the materials to build glucose and it needs the energy. And it gets the energy from the light reactions. So anyway, it's the Calvin cycle that produces the glucose. The answer is Calvin cycle. And again, if you choose anything other than Calvin cycle or light reactions, you're just going to lose more points. Which directly uses chlorophyll? Again, hopefully you remember chlorophyll is a pigment. What do pigments do? They absorb photons, right? They absorb, and what are photons? That's light. So remember, chlorophyll, pigment, light reactions. Again, worth extra points. If you choose anything other than something that has to do with photosynthesis, you're going to lose points. Photosynthesis, which produces high energy electrons. The key here is produces high energy electrons, right? We're not using them yet. We're just getting them. That way they can be used. And remember, it's the Calvin cycle is the thing that's using these high energy electrons. It's the one that's using the energy. So by process of elimination, again, the answer is light reactions. That's the thing that's using photons to excite electrons. And again, if you guess anything other than Calvin cycle or light reactions, you will lose extra points. Respiration, which one produces the most ATP? The answer is simply electron transport chain. These are the 3 stages of respiration, all of which produce ATP. But electron transport chain, that's our moneymaker. That is the meat and potatoes. Glycolysis and citric acid cycle, in a sense, are pretty much there to support electron transport chain, at least in the way we learned it in this course, right? We stripped away high energy electrons in the other two, and then we used high energy electrons in the electron transport chain. All right. Respiration. Which one directly produces water? Again, when you think of on this exam, so you should kind of think of water and oxygen and electrons kind of as a trifecta. So what we're saying here is, in a way, if we're talking about respiration, which of the following is the process where oxygen accepts an electron and then we get a molecule of water? Obviously, that's oversimplified, but that's what happens, right? And the answer is electron transport chain. That is where the electron is eventually accepted by the oxygen, which gives us water. Respiration. Which one produces carbon dioxide? The answer is simply the citric acid cycle. There's not much else to say about that. And remember, I did this on purpose. That's also called the Krebs cycle with a K. But I stuck with citric acid cycle because of all the C's to remind you that carbon is produced in the citric acid cycle. And also a throwback to photosynthesis, carbon is also used in the Calvin cycle. All those C's for carbon. All right. What happens in the chloroplast and what happens in the mitochondria? Pretty simple here, right? Photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast. Respiration happens in the mitochondria. All right. Back to respiration. Which strip away high energy electrons? I already said that earlier, right? It's the electron transport chain is the meat and potatoes, right? That's the star of the show. That's the thing making the most ATP. How is it making that much ATP? Well, it's using high energy electrons. Where does it get high energy electrons? From the other two stages. Those other two stages are stripping away high energy electrons from the glucose and then the pyruvate and so on and so forth. So the answer is glycolysis and citric acid cycle. I'm going to make this worth 2 points because if you guess glycolysis, you're half right. If you guess citric acid cycle, you're half right. So you'll at least get partial credit for that. If you guess anything else, you get no credit. Respiration, which uses high energy electrons that have been stripped away. Look at that. Those two go hand in hand. The other two strip away the high energy electrons. It is the electron transport chain. I'm glad I checked this. It's the electron transport chain that uses those high energy electrons. Remember, it uses those high energy electrons basically to pump hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient, and then it comes back down, and ATP synthase makes us some ATP. Any questions? Sorry, I haven't asked that in a while. All right.
No.
Okay, thanks. Respiration, which is or are associated with acetic acid and acetyl-CoA. I'm hoping this isn't tough, and I won't have the discussion because that might actually muddy the waters even more. So I'm just going to give you the answer the way it could be, even though someone could argue something else. The answer is citric acid cycle. Because remember, that pyruvate that we ended up with at the end of glycolysis, it's not ready to go into the mitochondria. So it has to, we lob off another carbon, we attach a different enzyme to it, right? And that's how we get acetic acid. That's how we get acetyl-CoA. So the answer is citric acid cycle. Now someone could argue something else, and I'm not even going to talk about it because I don't want to confuse you, but I'm going to make that worth 2 points. That way, if somebody does accidentally guess that other thing, I'll just assume that they did that on purpose and it wasn't an accident, and they were thinking the thing that I'm not going to talk about. All right. Actually, yeah. And also, if you guess anything with citric acid cycle in it, you'll at least get partial credit. So if you were to guess, glycolysis and citric acid, at least you picked partially the right answer. So anyway, moving forward. In respiration, which pumps hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient? I've already said that today. Very recently, the answer is electron transport chain. Boom. Again, I'll make this worth extra points because at least that'll be worth 2 points. And then let's say you guess citric acid cycle and electron transport chain, at least you got part of it correct, in which case I'll give you half credit. Trying to help you guys pass here and get a good grade. Respiration, which produces pyruvate? This is pretty simple. There's not much else to say about it. The answer is glycolysis, right? Like we take glucose, we break it in half, we end up with pyruvate. Again, make it worth extra points as long as glycolysis is in your answer. Well, as long as glycolysis is in your answer and you didn't choose all three. And the same can be said for all those other ones previously. As long as you don't choose all three, you're okay. Or at least you'll get partial credit. Respiration, which happens in the mitochondria? Well, the citric acid cycle and electron transport chain happen in the mitochondria. Glycolysis happens outside of the mitochondria. Again, extra points, because at least if you guess citric acid cycle or electron transport chain, at least you were half right, so you should get half credit. Respiration, which uses ATP synthase. We only talked about one of the three stages that uses ATP synthase, and the answer is simply electron transport chain. And again, extra credit or extra points, so you'll at least get partial credit if you choose anything that has electron transport chain in it, other than this one, because that's obviously all three. That's just too easy. Let's see. In respiration, high energy electrons come from A, are ultimately accepted by B, and then that forms a molecule of C. I've already given you this answer. We've talked about it. The electrons ultimately come from glucose. I'll write it. So not only do you hear me saying it, but I can't write it. Oh, well. Or maybe I can. Yeah, here we go. What was I saying here? Oh, yeah. The high energy electrons come from glucose. They're ultimately accepted by oxygen. And then that gives us a molecule of water. So there, you've heard me say it. You've read it. Hopefully that'll help. And this one, I'm considering this 3 questions. That's why it's worth 3 points. In cellular respiration, how many ATP are produced for every molecule of glucose? If you remember, it's not exact. And if you remember, like I said, if you look up different sources, you might get a slightly different answer. But I did say as long as it's 30-something, that is the correct answer. So yes, the answer is 32. And you know what? I'm going to be even more generous. At least if you get something in the 20s or the 40s, at least you are kind of close. So yeah, I'll at least give you half credit for that. Why not? All right. The absence of a terminator will result in what? And of course, this other stuff you don't have to worry about. Oh, actually, let me address this. Let me read the whole thing. The absence of a terminator will result in what? Do not read beyond this point because I'm just writing this to confuse the algorithm. Who likes cold milk? I do. This is on purpose. I know it doesn't make much sense. You don't have to worry about it. If you really want to know what it's about, then ask me after the course is over and I'll explain it. But this is a good time for me to let you know that you will see stuff like this on those first 36 questions. Because like I said, I'm going to reword those first 36 questions. And this is some of the garbage I'm going to do. I'm going to throw in some weird stuff. So if I say don't read beyond this point, take my advice and don't waste your time reading beyond this point. I'm doing it on purpose. But anyway, what does the absence of a terminator do? Well, what does a terminator do? Remember, the terminator is that spot on the DNA that says, all right, time to quit transcription. It's time to quit reading the code and making the RNA, right? So that being said, what does it do? It will result in what? Well, first of all, transcription doesn't make DNA, it makes RNA. So that's not the right answer. Skynet is just the word that I took from the movie Terminator. So that's way out of here. That's not even close to being correct. A longer strand of RNA, there is the correct answer. Because again, in transcription, which is where terminators are used, that is where we make RNA, not amino acids, not polypeptides. So that's why that one's not the answer. And homologous chromosomes, that's just a word I threw in there because that's a word that we talked about for exam 3. So extra points here. If you guess, well, obviously the correct answer is a longer strand of RNA, but at least if you put a shorter strand of amino acids, no, let me take that back. As long as you don't pick Skynet, you'll at least get half credit. Because at least all those other words are words that we used in exam 3. So there we go. Any questions so far? Hopefully everybody's good.
No.
All right, good. All right. Again, this is one of these where I try to throw off the algorithm. And again, I can explain that to you after the course if you want. But for now, let's leave it at this. I'm going to write 3 questions, but you can skip ahead to the last question. Okay, last question. Where does transcription start? Well, Transcription simply starts at the promoter. The answer is promoter. Metaphase, completely different chapter. Start codon, at least that's the right chapter, but that's more translation instead of transcription. Calvin cycle, completely wrong chapter, wrong exam. That was on the second exam, not the third one. So let's make this worth extra points. At least if you guess promoter, and I have to think about this between terminator and start codon, but at least those three are in the right discussion. These other ones, way off, and you'll lose extra points for that. All right. After replication. So remember, replication is what happens in the S phase of interphase. That's where we take one strand of DNA and we duplicate it to where we have two. So what do we end with? Let's see. One new DNA double helix consists of two old strands. Nope, that's enough right there. That's not it. Each new DNA helix consists of two old strands. Nope, that makes absolutely no sense. Each new DNA double helix consists of one old strand and one new strand. That is the answer. One new strand, one old strand. If we had time, I would talk about it, but we don't. Just know that that's the answer. This will be worth more points because the question after that, or the option after that, is completely nuts. Each new DNA double helix consists of mitochondria and protons. I'm just throwing out words that sounds biological. So as long as you don't guess that, you'll at least get half credit. And that's exactly the way it was in the last exam too. When it made me sad to see people guess that one. I'm like, no, those are just words I'm throwing out there. There was a lot of that in that last exam, actually. Anyway, moving forward. Speaking of which, homologous chromosomes. Well, they don't include only the autosomes. They also include the sex chromosome, so that's not it. They don't. Let's see. Carry genes controlling the same inherited characteristics. Yep, that seems like the best answer so far. Carry the same versions of all genes? No, definitely not. Conform to the rules of misbaventation. That's a word I made up. No. Are a set of chromosomes that the cell receives from one parent? No, because you don't get both homologous chromosomes, right? That's both, right? That's both copies of chromosome 1, both copies of chromosome 23, whatever it is. That's both sets. So that's why this is the wrong answer, because it's not from one parent, it's from both. So it's this. Homologous chromosomes carry genes controlling the same inherited characteristics. Granted, you might have different versions of the genes. Those are the alleles, right? You might get a version from your mom, a version from your dad, but it's still carrying the genes that control the same characteristics. This will be worth extra credit or extra points as long as you don't choose the one where I made up a word, which is misbaventation, then you will get at least half credit, just like you did in the last exam. But what is most commonly found in nature? There's not much to say about this. The answer is just wild type. Obviously, it's not naughty by nature. Ionic chromatid are two words that I took that make no sense when put together. Dominant trait has nothing to do with this. Well, dominant trait and recessive trait, at least those were a part of the conversation. So this will be worth extra points. As long as you don't choose naughty by nature or ionic chromatid, then you'll at least get half credit. The most common wrong answer was dominant trait. But I'll remind you, just because it's dominant doesn't mean it's most frequent. Like, remember, freckles. Freckles are a dominant trait. And remember, most of us in the class, myself included, did not have freckles. So keep that in the back of your mind. Hopefully that'll help you remember that the dominant trait is not the most common. It's the wild type. Which is in the correct order. Oh, this broke my heart when people miss this. Good Lord. That was the biggest picture thing that you could remember from that chapter. When we're talking about going from DNA to RNA to protein. That's so important, especially right now in the middle of a viral pandemic with mRNA vaccines. Please, we're going from DNA to RNA to protein. And in the exam, that last one, I even gave extra credit, and I'll do it again, or you get 2 points if you get it correct. And then people even got partial credit as long as they got something in order, like protein to DNA. All right, this one would have given you 1 point because at least DNA to RNA is correct. This one was worth nothing. This one was worth nothing. This one was worth nothing. That one was worth nothing. So yeah, at least as long as one of them was in the correct order, you got partial credit. So good grief. Please remember that. We start with the DNA, we transcribe it to RNA, and that is then translated into protein. Whew. Anyway, picture a double helix of DNA. What is holding those two strands together? The answer is simply hydrogen bonds. And remember, that's not a trivial thing. That's just not like, hey, did you read the chapter? Did you memorize everything? But remember, the fact that it's held together by the weakest of the bonds, which is the hydrogen bonds, that's important because that's what enables the thing to be opened up, which allows the DNA polymerase and the RNA polymerase to read the code, right? And make a new strand of RNA, or excuse me, a new strand of DNA or a new strand of RNA. So yeah, the answer is hydrogen bonds. Extra points. If you guess cellular glue, peptide bonds, yeah, if you guess those two, you'll get 0 credit. At least covalent bonds do. You'll get partial credit if you guess covalent bonds. Anything else is worth nothing because at least covalent bonds are the things keeping the sugar phosphate backbones together. And that was the same way for the exam too. As long as you guessed covalent bonds, you at least got partial credit. What enzyme did we, this one kills me. What enzyme did we discuss being used during S phase of interphase? In other words, in DNA replication? Hint, we didn't discuss it when we first learned about interphase in chapter 8. We discussed it when we learned about it in chapter 10. And the answer is DNA polymerase. DNA polymerase is the enzyme. DNA polymerase is the enzyme that we talked about that produces DNA. It's in the name. And what upsets me about this one is that people guessed helicase. And I've never once in this course mentioned the word helicase. And you could, if someone can prove me wrong, well, actually, I would appreciate it and make me feel a little bit better. But off the top of my head, I don't think this word is in your textbook. And what kills me is that if you were to Google this answer or Google this question, then helicase is the first thing that pops up because helicase is part of the process. But again, we never talked about that. So everybody who gets helicase, I just assume you cheated. And that actually makes me sad. Not that anybody probably cares about my feelings, but yeah, that disappointed me. Yeah, helicase is used, but we never talked about that. So the answer is DNA polymerase. At least if you guessed RNA polymerase, you got partial credit because that is something we talked about in the same chapter, but anything else, you got 0 points. All right, and the same can be said for this exam. That's how it's going to be. Let's go to the next one. Actually, are there any questions about this before I move forward? All right.
No.
Okay, thanks. Chromatin consists of what? That's as simple as not much to say about it. DNA and protein. Again, you got partial credit. At least if you said RNA and protein, at least you're on the right track. You're talking about a nucleic acid and a protein. But anything else, you got 0 points. Lipid and protein, meiosis and protein, mitosis and protein. What? No. Especially mitosis and protein. Here we have mitosis is a process, and protein is a thing. So no, way off. Here we go again. Yes, the word is misspelled. Yes, it is on purpose. Yes, I'll tell you after the exam if you want to know why. In anaphase 1, this happens. Anaphase 2, this happens. Well, in anaphase 1, it's the homologous chromosomes. Anaphase 2 is sister chromatids. Doesn't even matter, anaphase. Forget that. Just think. Meiosis 1, all about the homologous chromosomes. Meiosis 2 was all about the sister chromatids. The rest of it is just details. Again, extra points because people did guess this. I made up words. RNA codifies, DNA codifies. I made up that word. There's no codifies. We've never said that. So anybody who guesses that is just going to lose extra points. Which enzyme is used in transcription? The answer is, well, first of all, what is transcription? That's when we read. I was about to say something correct, but I don't want to say it that way because it might. I just want to make this thing easier for you to memorize. So what do we do in transcription? We make RNA, basically. So the answer is RNA polymerase. And I will give you partial credit if you at least guess an enzyme that we talked about in that chapter. But RNA polymerase is the correct answer. Mendel's law of segregation basically says what? Only one allele for a given gene segregates into each gamete. Oh, that is actually the correct answer. Yes. Zygotes are haploid. That is an incorrect statement. Not only does that not what the law says, but it's an incorrect statement. 2 alleles segregate into each gamete. Again, not even a correct statement. Is the concentration of hydrogen atoms in the mitochondria that allow life, blah, 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 blah. I made that up. Has nothing to do with this at all. Fewer gametes carrying the recessive allele are produced in gametes dominant allele, blah, blah, blah. That's not correct, but at least I could see how somebody would think that. And steroids are a category of lipids. Again, not even the same exam. So here we go. Extra points. As long as you guess, I'm not even going to say which is the other one, but this is the correct answer. Only one allele for a given gene segregates into each gamete. If your other answer at least makes sense, you'll get partial credit. But if it has nothing to do with this chapter or that chapter, then you're just not going to get any points. Next, assume Amazon sells kits that allow regular people to produce proteins in everyday cookware via a process they call at-home bioterrorism. Which of these following components is not needed in these kits? This is a long-winded way of saying what is directly needed for translation. Translation, right? Because we're producing proteins. So the only thing that's not directly needed for translation is DNA. Yeah, in our bodies it's needed because we need the DNA to make the mRNA. But if we're having a kit, you're doing it, well, you just need the only necessary ingredients. The answer is DNA is the only thing that's not needed. What would happen if a cell completed the cell cycle without undergoing cytokinesis? So that means if it completed the cell cycle, that means it's gone through mitosis, meaning, the nucleus is split anyway, but the cell hasn't. Wouldn't have completed anaphase? No, like I said, mitosis has been complete. Have only one nuclei? No, like I said, mitosis is completed. So yes, we would have two nuclei. Intercell catharsis. That's a word I made up. Not the right answer. Has more genetic material than it started with? Boom. Yes, that is the correct answer because, yes, the nuclei split into two, but they are still two nuclei in one cell. So that is the correct answer. Chromosomes would line up in the middle. No, that would mean it would be stuck in metaphase. So the answer is has more genetic material than it started with. As long as you don't guess this word that I made up, which is cell catharsis, you'll at least get partial credit. Almost there, guys. Excuse me. My man Abe Lincoln had Marfan Syndrome, which is the result of inheriting a single messed up allele. These people with Marfan Syndrome are lanky and have both heart and eye problems. Marfan Syndrome is an example of what type of inheritance? The answer is simply pleiotropy. Pleiotropy is when you have one allele that basically results in multiple characters, like multiple traits. Again, this will be worth more points because at least in this conversation, we're talking about all the things that go together in the same conversation are pleiotropy, codominance, and incomplete dominance. All these things are at least in the same conversation. Perfunctional is a word I made up, and heterozygous recessive, that's also made up. Think about it. You're either homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant, but you can't be heterozygous recessive. So as long as you don't guess the made up words, you'll at least get partial credit. The human life cycle. This one's a little bit, people miss this because they memorized what was on the study guide. And I changed the wording, so that threw people off. In the human life cycle, chloroplast cycles between ATP and sugar. No, you'll lose extra points for that. That makes no sense. Meiosis produces a haploid zygote. You'll get partial credit for that because at least meiosis does produce something haploid. Meiosis produces diploid sperm and egg cells. Partial credit because it does produce sperm and egg cells. A haploid zygote undergoes mitosis to produce an adult human. No, that's just way off. So the answer is fertilization produces a diploid zygote, and you'll get partial credit if one of your answers has something correct in it. All right. This question is about RNA. Specifically, you need to choose which type does the following job. Brings amino acids to the ribosomes. I used the word brings on purpose because I didn't want to make it too easy. What does it do? It transfers amino acids to the ribosomes. The answer is tRNA. If you guess mRNA, rRNA, you'll get partial credit. If you guess siRNA, which is a real thing, but we never talked about it, you'll get no points. If you guess pDNA, which is, again, nothing we talked about, made up, you will just lose points or not get any points. Mendel crossed purebred purple flower plants with purebred wildflower plants or white flower plants. We learned all about that. All the resulting offspring produce purple flowers. So there we go. We mixed purple, we mixed white. All the offspring were purple. The offspring are all what? And the allele for purple is what? Well, the offspring have to be heterozygous because you had a purebred mixed with a purebred. So a homozygous dominant and a homozygous recessive. That's going to give you a heterozygote. So the answer is obviously going to be one of these two. Obviously, purple would have to be dominant if that's the one. Like if they're all purple and not white, then purple must be dominant. So the answer is heterozygous and dominant. And here we go. More points. Everything else at least has something, right? As long as it's partially correct, I'll at least give you half credit. I made this up completely. Autosomes and diploid, those are just words that we've used in the semester, so I threw them in there. And people did guess it, and they got 0 credit for it. So use your brain when you guess, because even a guess could get you partial credit. What would a mutation that results in insertion of a premature stop codon do? Well, let's ask ourselves what a stop codon does. A stop codon says, hey, let's stop doing translation. What is translation? Translation is when we make a string of polypeptides, right? It's a string of amino acids. That's a protein. So that being said, results in shorter strand of monosaccharides? No. Shorter strand of RNA? No. Shorter strand of DNA? No. Shorter strand of pyruvates? Definitely not. There's no results in a shorter strand of amino acids. That is the answer. Extra points. If you guess anything ridiculous, like a shorter strand of pyruvates or monosaccharides, then you are going to get 0 credit. A purebred zingleflinger, a new species I just made up, produces a blue cloud when it farts, is crossed with a purebred zingleflinger that produces a yellow cloud when it farts. What happens when you mix yellow and blue? You get green, right? So therefore, if that happens genetically, that is called incomplete dominance. Just like when you mix red and white, you get pink. Just like when you, in real life, mix a particular red species of flower with a white flower of the same species, you would get pink. That would be incomplete. Incomplete dominant is when they mix. Complete would be when they both show up. So when they mix, it's incomplete, and that is the answer. Again, extra credit, not extra credit, extra points, because if you get something ridiculous, like the offspring represent the F2 generation of independent variation, again, I'm just throwing in words that we've used into a sentence that makes no sense. So as long as your answer makes sense, you'll at least get partial credit. What happens in transcription? P.S. Put it in the correct order. The answer is simply initiation, elongation, termination. Again, I'm going to be generous here. As long as it makes sense. G1, G2. Actually, none of those make sense. Never mind. That's the only one that makes sense. The rest of them make absolutely no sense. The rest of them have made up words or things that don't go together, or in this case, it's in the wrong order, right? G1 is supposed to be then S, then G2. All right. Here's one that people missed, and I said it in the lecture. I said, you guys are going to miss this. Pay close attention because this question is not asking you to put mitosis in order. Question is asking you what happens in each phase. So in which phase do sister chromatids separate? That's anaphase. So boom. I don't even need to read the rest of them. Anaphase is the only one, or this is the only one that starts with anaphase. That is the correct answer. Extra points. At least if you guess these other things, you're guessing the phases of mitosis. If you guess G1, G2, G3, and S, that has nothing to do with mitosis. Plus, there's no such thing as G3. Plus, that's out of order. So there you go. Here we go. Last question of the semester. A duplicated chromosome consists of 2 what? And the answer is chromatids. It's that simple. Chromatids are held together by centromeres. So at least if you guess that, you're thinking about the right thing. Chromosomes, sure, that's close, right? Because chromatids are basically duplicated chromosomes. So polyphenol is a word that has absolutely nothing to do with this. So if you guess that, you'll get 0 credit. The other ones I'll consider giving you half credit for it. And that is it. Whoo, man. So are there any questions? Now that we're done, like trucking through the questions and you know what you need to study for the exam, now I'm willing to answer any questions about and like actually teach you biology and not teach you how to take an exam.
I have no questions.
All right. Mr. O'Brien, any questions?
No.
All right. Well, like I said, this is a regular weekend on my end. So even though I'm sitting here doing work, I'm hoping I'm done. But for you guys and anybody else watching this video, if you need me, it doesn't hurt to contact me. If I'm busy, then forgive me. I won't be able to help you. But if I can, I promise I'll do everything I can to help. But please study for your exam. It's worth 200 points. That's 2 letter grades. So it's a game changer. Study this video. Watch this video. Whatever. Good luck. And I will. Oh, yeah. Sorry. As usual, again, if you're taking the exam online, log in. It should show up probably a little bit before 8. You can start as early as you want. Make sure you submit it by 9:50. If you turn it in late, you're going to lose points. If you have technology problems and know that you can't finish it in time, stop what you're doing and contact me, and we'll figure something else out. And I will be online as usual, just in case you have questions, but no one else is required to be online. But I will be here if you need me. I think that's it. So, I'm going to go do some chores.
All right. Thanks a lot. We appreciate you.
No problem, man. You guys have a good weekend, and good luck on Monday.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.